Hello all, welcome to the next session on storage area networks. In this session, let us just discuss the implementations of security in storage networking. Okay, let us first begin with Fiber Channel Storage Area Network or FCSAN. What is an FCSAN? An FCSAN is configured as an isolated private environment with fewer nodes than an IP network. The number of nodes when compared to an IP network is relatively less in a fiber channel storage area network. It's an isolated private network also. Okay, it's only meant for storing and retrieving the data over a network. Fiber channel storage area networks impose fewer security threats. Today, no single comprehensive security solution is available for fiber channel storage area networks. So fiber channel security protocol standards align security mechanisms and the algorithms between the IP and the fiber channel interconnects. Now, these standards describe the protocols to implement the security measures in the fiber channel fabric among the fabric elements and the endpoints within the fabric. Now, they include the guidelines for authenticating the fiber channel entities, setting up session keys, negotiating the parameters required to ensure the frame-by-frame integrity and confidentiality, and establishing along with distributing policies across a fiber channel fabric. Okay, now let us look at the fiber channel security architecture here. Now this diagram illustrates the various levels, or we can call them as zones, of a storage networking environment that must be secured and the security measures that can be deployed. Let us look at each of these zones in a bit more details. Let us consider this first zone, that is zone A. Okay, so here we have authentication at the management console. So let us see what is the protection strategy for this zone A. So here one protection strategy is restrict management LAN access to authorized users only, that is by locking down the MAC address here. Okay, that is one protection strategy we can have, that is by restricting the management LAN access to authorized users, that is by locking down the MAC addresses. Second protection strategy that we can have is to implement VPN tunneling for secure remote access to the management LAN. Okay, we can implement VPN tunneling at this zone A for secure remote access to the management LAN. Third protection strategy that we can have is use two-factor authentication for the network access. We can use two-factor authentication for the network access. So for this zone A, that is authentication of the management console. So we can either restrict management LAN access to the authorized users by locking down the MAC addresses, or we can implement VPN tunneling. Okay, that is for secure remote access to the management LAN, or else we can use two-factor authentication for the network access. That is for zone A. Now let us look at this next security zone, that is zone B. We are talking about the firewall here. So what are the protection strategies that we can have at zone B? So we can block inappropriate traffic by either filtering out the addresses that should not be allowed on your LAN. Okay, so we can filter out the addresses that should not be allowed on our LAN. So we can screen for allowable protocols and block the ports that are not in use. Okay, the firewall can screen the allowable protocols and it can block the ports that are not in use. Whichever ports that are not in use, that can be blocked. So that is zone B. Now let us look at or consider the zone C here. So it's basically access control switch, zone C. So here we can authenticate the user or administrators of the fiber channel switches using remote authentication dial in user service. Okay, in short form we call it as radius. R for remote, A for authentication, D for dial in, I for in, U for user, and S for service. So we call it as radius. So authenticate users and administrators of the fiber channel switches using radius, that is remote authentication dial in user service, or by using DHCHAP. What is this DHCHAP? So DH stands for Diffie-Hellman Challenge Handshake Authentication Protocol, and so on. So we can use a bunch of authentication protocols to authenticate the users and the administrators of the fiber channel switches, either by using radius or by using DHCHAP. That, so that stands for Diffie-Hellman Challenge Handshake Authentication Protocol. Now let us move on to the next zone here, that is the zone D, that is host to switch connectivity. So here we can restrict the fabric access to legitimate hosts by, first one is implementing ACLs, that is access control lists. So known host bus adapters can connect to specific ports only. Okay, we can map the host bus adapter to a specific switch, and we can ensure that the known host bus adapters can connect to only specific switch ports only. Second way is by implementing a secure zoning method such as port zoning. We are in module 2 we have discussed the different types of zoning, right? Worldwide name zoning, the port zoning, mixed zoning, and so on. Here we can implement secure zoning method such as port zoning, also known as hard zoning. So these are the different means by which we can restrict the fabric access to legitimate hosts. One is by implementing access control list, that is known host bus adapters can connect on specific switch ports only. Second way is by implementing a secure zoning method such as port zoning, also known as the hard zoning. Now let's move on to the next zone, that is zone E. Here we have switch to switch or switch to router connectivity. Okay, that is zone E. So here we can protect the traffic on the fabric by either using an expansion port authentication or by encrypting the traffic in transit and by implementing the fiber channel switch controls and the port controls. So here in this security zone E, which is concerned with the switch to switch and switch to router traffic, we can protect the traffic on the fabric by either using expansion ports or the E port authentication. One more way is by encrypting the traffic in transit, and the one more way is by implementing fiber channel switch controls and the port controls. The next security zone that we have is the zone F, which is about the distance extension. So here we can implement encryption for in-flight data by FC security protocols for long distance fiber channel extension, and by using IP security for SAN extension through the fiber channel IP or FCIP. And lastly, we have the security zone G, which is about the connectivity between the switch and the storage. So we can protect the storage arrays on our storage area network through something called as worldwide WWPN, okay, based LUN masking, or by session ID locking and masking based on the source fiber channel addresses. So what we do is the entire storage area network will break into multiple zones, and for each and every zone we implement different security policies, so or different security mechanisms. That is how we can implement security in storage area network. Now let us look at the basic SAN security mechanism. The first one we have is called as LUN masking and zoning. LUN masking and zoning are the basic SAN security mechanisms that is used to protect against unauthorized access to the storage. The standard implementations of LUN masking on storage arrays mask the LUNs to the front-end storage port based on the WWPNs of, that is the worldwide port names or port numbers of the host bus adapters. So WWPN zoning is preferred choice in security conscious environments. So LUN masking and zoning, they are the basic security mechanisms that are used to protect against the unauthorized access to the storage. The standard implementations of LUN masking on storage arrays mask the LUNs presented to a front-end storage port based on the WWPNs of source host bus adapters. So WWPN zoning is a preferred choice in security conscious environment. Now the next security mechanism in SAN we have is something called as securing switch ports. Security mechanisms such as port binding, port lockdown, port lockout, and persistent port disable can be implemented on the switch ports. So we can bind a port to a specific HBA, we can lock down a port, we can lock out a port, and we can have something called as persistent port disable. Port binding limits the number of devices that can attach to a particular switch port and allows only the corresponding switch port to connect to a node for fabric access. Port binding mitigates but does not eliminate the worldwide port number spoofing. Port lockdown and port lockout restrict switch ports type of initialization. whereas persistent port disable prevents the switch port from being enabled even after a switch reboot. So, securing switch ports. Here, the security mechanisms such as port binding, port lockdown, port lockout, and persistent port disables can be implemented on the switch ports, where the port binding limits the number of devices that can attach to a particular switch port and allows only the switch port or the corresponding switch port to connect to a node for fabric access. Port binding mitigates but does not eliminate the worldwide port numbers spoofing. Port lockdown and port lockout restrict the switch port's type of initialization, whereas persistent port disable prevents a switch port from being enabled even after a switch reboot. Now the next third SAN security mechanism that we have is the switch wide and fabric wide access control. Network security can be configured on a fiber channel switch by using something called as access control list on the fabric by using fabric binding. Access control lists incorporate the device connection. Access control lists they incorporate the device connection control and switch connection control policies. The device connection control policy specifies which host bus adapters can the storage and the storage ports can be of a can be a part of the fabric. So the device connection control policy specifies which host bus adapters and the storage ports can be a part of the fabric, thereby preventing unauthorized devices from accessing it. Similarly, the switch function control policy specifies which switches are allowed to be a part of the fabric, preventing unauthorized switches from joining it. So, fabric binding prevents an unauthorized switch from joining any existing switch in the fabric. It ensures that the authorized membership data exists on every switch, and any attempt to connect to any switch in the fabric by using inter-switch link causes the fabric to segment. So what is fabric binding? Fabric binding prevents an unauthorized switch from joining an existing switch in the fabric. Okay, that is what we call as fabric binding. So we discussed something called as the device connection control policy and the binding and the switch connection control policy. The device connection control policy specifies which which HBAs or the host bus adapters and the storage ports can be a part of the fabric, whereas the switch control connection policy or switch connection control policy specifies which switches are allowed to be a part of the fabric. Now we can have something called as RBAC or the role based access control. It provides additional security to a storage area network by preventing unauthorized activity on the fabric for management operations. It enables the security administrator to assign roles to the users that explicitly specify privileges or access rights after logging into the fabric. So that is switch wide and fabric wide access control. And the next SAN security mechanism that we are going to discuss is a logical partitioning of a fabric by implementing virtual SAN. Okay, so the SAN administrator can create distinct virtual SANs by populating each of them with the switch ports. In a switch ports are distributed over multiple SANs, maybe two or more. Okay, so zoning should be done for each virtual SAN to secure the entire physical storage area network. Each managed virtual SAN can have only one zone set at a time. So the physical storage area network can be split into multiple virtual storage area network or the vSANs, and we are going to implement zoning for each of these SANs to secure the entire physical storage area network. Each managed virtual SAN can have only one active zone at a time. Virtual storage area networks or the virtual SANs minimize the impact of fabric-wide disruptive events because management and the control traffic on the storage area network, which may include remote state change notifications, zone set activation events, and more, does not traverse the virtual SAN boundaries. Therefore, the virtual SANs are a cost-effective alternate for building isolated physical fabrics. So virtual SANs contribute to information availability and security by isolating the fabric events and providing authorization control within a single fabric. So single large storage area network can be broken down into multiple virtual SANs, and we can manage these virtual SANs in a better way, thereby securing the entire physical storage area networks. So these were some of the fiber channel storage area network security mechanisms. We discussed LUN masking and zoning, securing switch ports, switch wide and fabric wide access control, and lastly logical partitioning of a fabric using virtual SAN. Now let us move on to understand how can the security implementations can be implemented in NAS, or the network attached storage. What is NAS? Network attached storage is open to multiple exploits, okay, including the viruses, worms, unauthorized access, snooping, and data tampering, because it involves file sharing. So NAS is open to multiple exploits, includes the viruses, the worms, unauthorized access, snooping, and data tampering. Various security mechanisms are implemented in NAS to secure the data and the storage networking infrastructures. Permissions and the access control lists from the first level of protection to NAS resources by restricting the accessibility and the sharing. So permissions and the access control list, they form the first level of protection to the network attached storage resources by restricting accessibility and sharing. Now these permissions are deployed over and above the default behaviors and the attributes associated with the files and the folders. Now in addition, various other authentication and authorized mechanisms such as Kerberos and directory services are implemented to verify the identity of the network users and define their privileges. Similarly, firewalls protect the storage infrastructure from unauthorized access and malicious attacks. So NAS file sharing. So in Windows environment, Windows supports two types of access control lists. That is, we have something called as DSCLs and SSCLs. DSCL stands for discrete access control list and SSCL stands for system access control list. In addition, so the DACL, or the discrete access control list, they determine the access control, whereas the system access control list, or the SSCLs, determines what accesses need to be audited if auditing is enabled. So DSCL determines the access control and the SSCL is used to specify the auditing details. In addition to these access control lists, Windows also supports the concept of something called as the object ownership. The owner of an object has hard-coded rights to that particular object, and these rights do not need to be explicitly granted in the SSCL, or the system access control list. The owner, the SSCL, and the DSCL are all statistically held as attributes of each object. Windows also offers the functionality to inherit permissions, which allows the child objects existing within a parent object to automatically inherit the access control list of the parent object. The access control lists are also applied to the directory objects known as the security identifiers, or the SIDs. These are automatically generated by the Windows server or domain when a user or a group is created, and they are abstracted from the user. So in this way, though a user may identify his login ID as user1, it is simply a textual representation of the true SID which is used by the underlying operating system. Internal processes in Windows refer to an account's SID rather than an account's username or a group name while granting access to the object. Access control lists are set by using the standard Windows Explorer graphical user interface, but can also be configured with the command line interface commands or other third-party tools. So remember, there are two types of access control lists in Windows. While it's used for NAS file sharing, the first one we have is something called as discrete access control list, which determines the access control, and the second type of access control list we have is something called as a system access control list, which determines what accesses need to be audited if at all the auditing is required. Okay, now let us move on to the Unix permissions for the NAS file sharing. For the Unix operating system, a user is an abstraction that denotes a logical entity for assignment of ownership and the operation privileges for the system. A user can be either a person or a system operation. A Unix system is only aware of the privileges of the user to perform specific operations on the system and identifies each user by a user ID or the UID and the username, regardless of whether it is a person, a system operation, or a device. So in Unix, a system is only aware of the privileges of the user to perform specific operations on the system and identifies each user by the UID and the username. In Unix, users can be organized into one or more groups. The concept of group servers or the concept of group serves the purpose to assign sets of privileges for a given resource and sharing them among many users that need them. For example, a group of people working on one project may need the same permission for a set of files. So we can also have group permissions in Unix. Unix permissions specify the operation that can be performed by any ownership relation with respect to a given file. So in simpler terms, these permissions specify what the owner can do, what the owner group can do, and what everyone else can do with the file. For any given ownership relation, these three bits are used to specify the access permission. The first bit denotes read, that is R symbol. It denotes the read access. The second bit is W, that denotes the write access, and the third bit denotes the symbol X, that denotes the execute access. So we have the read, write, and execute RWX permissions in Unix, or the permission codes in Unix. Because Unix defines three ownership relations, that is owner permission, group permission, and all permission, a triplet defining the access permission is required for ownership relationship, resulting in 9 bits. So 3 bits for the owner, 3 bits for the group, and 3 bits for the all other users. What are the 3 bits? Read bit, the write bit, and the execute bit. That is what we call as a triplet. It's required for each ownership resulting in the total 9 bits. Each bit can either be set or clear. So when displayed, a set bit is marked by its corresponding operation letter, and a clear bit is denoted by a dash. Suppose we want to set read, write, execute permissions for the owner, and read and execute permission for the others, and read and execute permission for all other users. The permission or the 9 bits representation will be RWX, R-X, R-X. So in this example, the owner can do anything with the file, but the group owners and the rest of the world can only read and execute the file. When displayed, a character denoting the mode of the file may precede this 9-bit pattern. For example, if the file is a directory, it is denoted as D, and if it is a link, it is denoted by L. Right? So that is the Unix file permissions. Now let us look at the authentication and authorization in network attached storage file sharing. Let us first see what do you mean by authentication and what do you mean by authorization. Authentication requires verifying the identity of a network user, and therefore involves a login credential lookup in network information system server in the Unix environment. Authorization defines the user privileges in a given network. I hope we got the difference here. So authentication requires verifying the identity of a network user, and therefore involves login credential lookup on the network information system server in the Unix environment, whereas authorization defines the user privileges in a network. A Windows client is authenticated by a Windows domain controller that houses the Active Directory. The Active Directory uses LDAP to access, that is Lightweight Directory Access Protocol, to access the information about the network objects in the directory, and Kerberos for network security. For network security in Windows environment, for a Windows client, you can either use Windows domain controller, or we can use the Active Directory or the LDAP, and we can use Kerberos for network security. NAS devices use the same authentication techniques to validate the network user credentials as shown in this particular diagram, which depicts the authentication process in the NAS environment. Authorization defines user privileges in a given network. The authorization techniques for Unix users and Windows users are quite different. Unix files use mode bits to define access rights granted to the owners, the groups, and the other users, whereas Windows uses access control lists to allow or deny specific rights to a particular user for a particular file. So complexities arise when Unix and Windows users access and share data or access and share the same data. If the NAS device supports multiple protocols, the integrity of both permission methodologies must be maintained. At the same time, validate the domain controller and the network interface system server or the NIS server, network information system server, connectivity, and the bandwidth. If multi-protocol access is required, specific vendor access policy implementation need to be considered. As we can see here, we have one NAS device and a bunch of different servers and the clients. So whenever a Unix client wants to connect to this particular device, it has to be authenticated by the NIS server. Authentication happens at the NIS network information system server. Whereas if a Windows client wants to access the NAS device, it has to be authenticated through the Windows domain controller or the Active Directory using ADAP, the LDAP. Okay, so Windows uses the permissions for the Unix object. As you can see here, it stands for RWX, RWX, RWX. That means the file can be read, written, and executed by the owner, read, written, executed by the groups, and read, written, executed by all others. So Windows object access control list, we have SID ABC. So deny write. If the SID is X by Z, we specify to write, that is allow the write. So that is how we can have authentication and authorization in case of network attached storage for Windows and the the Unix environment. Now let us look at what do you mean by Kerberos. Kerberos is a network authentication protocol which is designed to provide strong authentication for client server applications. Okay, so it's a security network authentication protocol which is designed to provide strong authentication for the client server applications by using secret key cryptography. It uses cryptography so that the client and the server can prove their identity to each other across an insecure network connection. After the client and the server have proven their identities, they can choose to encrypt all their communication to ensure privacy and data integrity. So in Kerberos authentications between the clients and the servers takes place. The client gets a ticket for a service, and the server decrypts this ticket by using its secret key. An entity or any entity, user, or a host that gets a service ticket for a Kerberos service is called as a Kerberos client. So what is a Kerberos client? So any entity, user, or a host that gets a service ticket for Kerberos service is called as a Kerberos client. The term Kerberos server generally refers to KDC or the Key Distribution Center. The Key Distribution Center implements the authentication service and the ticket granting service. As we can see, we have something called as TGT, that stands for ticket granting ticket. So the Kerberos Key Distribution Center or the KDC implements the authentication service and the ticket granting service. The KDC or the Key Distribution Center has a copy of every password associated with every principal, so that it is obviously vital that the KDC remains secure. The Key Distribution Center should always remain secure. In Kerberos, users and servers for which a secret key is stored in the KDC database are known as the principals. So what is the principal in Kerberos? So in Kerberos, users and servers for which a secret key is stored in the KDC database are known as the principals. Let us try to understand the steps specified in this particular diagram. Here the user logs in. The user logs on to the workstation in the Active Directory domain using an ID and a password. So user logs in to to the terminal, a user logs in onto the workstation in the Active Directory domain using an ID and a password. The client computer sends a request to the authentication service running on the KDC, that is the key distribution center, for a Kerberos ticket. The key distribution center verifies the user's login credential from the Active Directory. The KDC or the key distribution center responds with an encrypted ticket granting ticket, or we can call it as TGT, and an encrypted session key. The ticket granting ticket has a limited validity period. The TGT or the ticket granting ticket can be decrypted only by the key distribution center, and the client can decrypt only the session key. So the key distribution center responds to the user with an encrypted ticket granting ticket and an encrypted session key after receiving the ID and the password from the user. The KDC responds with the ticket granting ticket and an encrypting session key. The ticket granting ticket has a limited validity period. TGT can be decrypted only by the key distribution center, and the client can decrypt only the session key. The next step is when the client requests a service from the server, it sends a request as it is given here, the stepwise number. Next step is when the client requests a service from the server, it sends a request in the form of previously generated ticket, TGT. So when the client requests a service from the server, it sends a request consisting of the previously generated ticket granting ticket, or the TGT, encrypted with the session key and the resource information available in the key distribution center. The next step is the key distribution center checks the permissions in the Active Directory and ensures that the user is authorized to use that particular service. So step number 4. The key distribution center checks the permissions in the Active Directory and ensures that the user is authorized to use that service. Step number 5. The key distribution center returns the service ticket to the client, that is mentioned here. In step 5, the key distribution center returns the service ticket to the client. This service ticket contains the fields addressed to the client and to the server hosting the service. The client then sends a service ticket to the server that houses the required resources. The server, in this case the NAS device, decrypts the server portion of the ticket and stores the information in the key tab file as it is shown here. So step number 6, the client sends the service ticket to the server that houses the required services or the required resources. The server in this case is a NAS device. So this is a NAS device here. So the NAS device that decrypts the server portion of the ticket and stores the information in a file called as a key tab file. As long as the client's Kerberos ticket is valid, this authorization process does not need to be repeated. So as long as the client's Kerberos ticket is valid, authorization process need not be repeated. The server automatically allows the client to access appropriate resources. The client server session is now established. The server returns an identifier, or it returns a session ID to the client, which tracks the client activities such as the file logging as long as the session is active. So after step number 7, that is after storing the ticket in the key tab file, the server automatically allows the clients to access the appropriate resources, and now a client server session is established. The server returns a session ID to the client, which tracks the client activity such as file logging as long as the session is active. So that is our Kerberos mechanism that is used for authentication process. Okay, so this is generally used in Windows environments. Now let us look at network layer firewalls. Let us try to understand what are these, or why are they required. Network layer firewalls are implemented in NAS environments to protect the NAS devices from various attacks initiated through the public IP network. So network layer firewalls are implemented in NAS environments to protect the NAS devices from various attacks initiated through the public IP network. Now these network layer firewalls can examine the network packets and compare them to a set of configured security rules. The network layer firewalls can examine the network packets and compare them to a set of configured security rules. Packets that are not authorized by a security rule are dropped and not allowed to continue to the destination. So the packets that are not authorized by a security rule are dropped and not allowed to continue to the destination. Rules can be established based on the source address, a destination address, a port, or a combination of those factors, that is, a source IP, a destination IP, and a port number. The effectiveness of a firewall depends on how robust and extensive the security rules are. A loosely defined security rule set can increase the probability of a security breach. As shown in this diagram, it depicts a typical firewall implementation. We have something called as a DMZ, or the demilitarized zone, which is commonly used in network environment. A demilitarized zone provides a means to secure the internal assets while allowing the internet based access to various resources. In a demilitarized zone environment, servers that are or the servers that need to be accessed through the internet are placed between these two, or between the two sets of firewalls. So whatever servers that needs access or which requires internet based access are placed within the two firewalls. It's sandwiched between the two firewalls. That zone between the two firewalls is called as a demilitarized zone. Application specific ports such as HTTP or FTP are allowed through the firewall to the DMZ servers. However, no internet based traffic is allowed to penetrate the second firewall and gain access to the internal network. Okay, so no internet based requests or internet based requests, no internet based traffic is allowed to penetrate the second firewall. So whatever internet based traffic that we have, that is only restricted to the application server. It is not allowed to penetrate the second set of firewalls and gain access to the internal network. The servers in the demilitarized zone may or may not be allowed to communicate with the internal resources. So in such a setup, the server in the demilitarized zone is an internet facing web application accessing data stored on a NAS device, which may be located on an internal private network. A secure design would serve only data to internal and external application through the demilitarized zones. That is what we call as a network layer firewalls. We have two firewalls which form a demilitarized zone. So one firewall allows the internet traffic through it, whereas other firewall blocks the internet traffic and protects the internal network from any attacks. So whichever servers that require internet based access will be placed between these two firewalls, which the zone is called as a demilitarized zone. So that is about the network layer firewalls. Now let us move on and discuss the next topic. That is, for authentication, we have something called as challenge handshake authentication protocol, which is generally implemented in IP storage area network. Okay, the challenge handshake authentication protocol, or the CHAP, is a basic authentication mechanism that has been widely adopted by the network devices and the hosts. So challenge handshake authentication protocol provides a method for initiators and the targets to authenticate each other by utilizing a secret code or a password. CHAP secrets are usually random secrets of 12 to 128 characters. The secret is never exchanged directly over the communication channel. Rather, a one-way hash function converts it into a hash value, which is then exchanged. A hash function using the MD5 algorithm transforms data in such a way that the result is unique and cannot be changed back to its original form, as shown in this particular diagram. So here initially the initiator initiates a login to the target. So the target sends a CHAP challenge back to the initiator. Third step, the initiator takes shared secret and calculates the value using one-way hash function and returns the hash value to the target. This is the fourth step. What is the next step? So computes the expected hash value from the shared secret and compares to value received from the initiator. That is step 5, and step 6 is if the value matches, authentication of the host is acknowledged. So that is our challenge handshake authentication protocol steps. If the initiator requires reverse tap authentication, the initiator authenticates the target by using the same procedure. The initiator can also authenticate the target as well using the similar procedure. The challenge handshake authentication protocol secret must be configured to on the initiator and the target. A challenge handshake authentication protocol entry composed of the name of the node and a secret associated with the node is maintained by the target and the initiator. The same steps are executed in two-way tap authentication scenario. So after these steps are completed, the initiator authenticates the target. So if both authentication steps succeed, then the data is allowed. Challenge handshake authentication protocol is often used because it's fairly simple protocol to implement and can be implemented across a number of disparate systems. So that is our challenge handshake authentication protocol, or CHAP. Now let us try to understand what do you mean by ISNS discovery domains. So what does ISNS stands for? Internet Storage Name Service. Internet Storage Name Service discovery domains. ISNS discovery domains function in the same way as the fiber channel zones. Discovery domains provide functional groupings of the devices in an IP SAN. In normal SAN we call it as zone, whereas in case of IP SAN we call them as ISNS discovery zones or discovery domains. For devices to communicate with one another, they must be configured in the same directory domain or the same discovery domain. State change notifications, or the SCNs, inform the Internet Storage Name Server when the devices are added or removed from a directory domain. So this diagram depicts the discovery domain in Internet Storage Name Service. Right? So what is this ISNS? Internet Storage Name Service discovery domains functions in the same way as the fiber channel zones. So we discussed CHAP, we discussed Kerberos, and we discussed security implementations in FCSAN and NAS. Now let us look at the security concerns in securing storage infrastructure in virtualized and cloud environments. Let us understand what are the security concerns that are involved. First, the security concern is multi-tenancy. So before that, we need to know that the organizations are rapidly adopting we need to know that the security or the business organizations are rapidly adopting the virtualizations and the cloud computing. However, they include some security concerns. Now these security concerns involve multi-tenancy, velocity of attack, information assurance, and the data privacy. Let us look at these one by one. Multi-tenancy. What is multi-tenancy? Multi-tenancy enables multiple independent tenants to be serviced using a same set of storage resources. So one server can be accessed by multiple clients. We can call it as multi-tenancy. It enables multiple independent tenants to be serviced using the same set of storage resources. In spite of the benefits offered by multi-tenancy, it is still a key security concern for users and the service providers. Co-location of multiple virtual machines in a single server and sharing the same resources increase the attack surface. Right? So coexistence of multiple tenants or co-location of multiple virtual machines in a single server and sharing the same resources increase the attack surface. It may happen that business critical data of one tenant is being accessed by other competing tenants who run the application using the same resources. Since one server is being shared or one storage resource is being shared by multiple virtual machines at the same time, it may happen that the business critical data of one tenant is accessed by the other competing tenants who run the applications using the same set of resources. The second security challenge is the velocity of the attack. Velocity of attack refers to a situation in which any existing security threat in a cloud spreads more rapidly and has a larger impact than in a traditional data center environment. So velocity of attack refers to a situation in which any existing security threat in the cloud spreads more rapidly and has a larger impact than sharing the files in a traditional data center environments. Information assurance for users is the next security concern. Information assurance for the users ensures the confidentiality, integrity, and availability of the data in the cloud. The tracking and auditing the confidentiality, integrity, and availability is also a huge challenge. Hence, information assurance is a huge challenge or a huge security concern while securing the cloud environments. Also, the cloud user needs assurance that all the users operating on the cloud are genuine and access the data only with legitimate rights and the scope. So, for information assurance on the cloud user needs assurance that all the users operating the cloud are genuine and access the data only with legitimate rights and the scope. And the last security concern that we need to discuss is the data privacy. Data privacy is also a major concern in virtualized and cloud environment. The cloud service provider needs to determine or needs to ensure that personally identifiable information about its clients is legally processed from any one of the unauthorized or from any unauthorized disclosure. A cloud service provider must ensure that the personally identification information or the personally identifiable information about its clients is legally processed by any of its unauthorized from any unauthorized disclosure. These are the four security concerns, that is multi-tenancy, velocity of attack, information assurance, and the data privacy. Now let us look at some of the security measures that we can have in order to overcome the security challenges or the security concerns. We can have security at three different levels. We can have security at the compute level, we can have the security at the network level, or the security at the storage level. Let us look at each of these levels, security at each of these levels one by one. Security at the compute level. So securing a compute infrastructure includes enforcing the security of the physical server, the hypervisor, virtual machine, and the guest operating system, that is the operating system running within a virtual machine. Physical server security, it involves implementing user authentication and authorization mechanisms. Now these mechanisms identify the users and provide access privileges on the server. To minimize the attack surface on the server, unused hardware components such as network interface cards, the USB ports, or the drives should be removed or disabled. A hypervisor is a single point of security failure for all the virtual machines that are running on it. Rootkits and malwares installed on the hypervisor make detection difficult for the antivirus software installed on the guest OS. To protect against attacks, security critical hypervisor updates should be installed regularly. Further, the hypervisor management system must also be protected. Access to the management system should be restricted to authorized administrators. Furthermore, there must be a separate firewall installed between the management system and the rest of the network. So virtual machine isolation and hardening are some of the common security mechanisms to effectively safeguard a server from the virtual machine or to secure the virtual machine from an attack. Let us see what you mean by virtual machine isolation and hardening. Virtual machine isolation helps to prevent a compromised guest operating system from impacting other guest operating systems. Virtual machine isolation is implemented at the hypervisor level. So virtual machine isolation helps prevent a compromised guest operating system from impacting other guest operating systems. The next process we can have, the next security mechanism that we can have to safeguard a virtual machine is hardening. Hardening is a process to change the default configuration to achieve greater security. Rather than sticking on to the default configuration, we can change the default configuration to achieve the greater security in the virtual machine. That is called as hardening. So apart from the measures to secure a hypervisor and the virtual machines, virtualized and the cloud environments also require further measures on the guest operating system and the application level. So security at the computation level or the compute level, it includes enforcing the security of the physical server, the hypervisor, virtual machines, and the guest operating systems. Now let us look at the security at the network level. The key security measures that minimize vulnerabilities at the network layer are the firewall. It includes intrusion detection, it includes demilitarized zone, and encryption of the data in flight. How does a firewall protect the data or protect the resources at the network level? A firewall protects the networks from unauthorized access while permitting only the legitimate communications. So in a virtualized or a cloud environment, a firewall can also protect hypervisors and the virtual machines. For example, if remote administration is enabled on a hypervisor, access to all the remote administration interfaces should be restricted by a firewall. So a firewall also secures virtual machine to virtual machine traffic or VM to VM traffic. This firewall service can be provided using a virtual firewall. A virtual firewall is a firewall service running entirely on a hypervisor. A virtual firewall provides packet filtering and monitoring of the virtual machine to virtual machine traffic. A virtual firewall gives the visibility and the control over the virtual machine traffic and enforces policy at the virtual machine level. Okay. So then we have something called as ID or intrusion detection. Intrusion detection is the process to detect the events that can compromise the confidentiality, integrity, or the availability of a resource. An intrusion detection system automatically analyzes events to check whether an event or a sequence of events match known patterns for anomalous activity or whether it is different from most of the other events in a given system. So it generates an alert if an irregularity is detected. So an intrusion detection system automatically analyzes events to check whether an event or a sequence of events matches a known pattern for anomalous activity or whether it is different from most of the other events in the system. So it generates an alert if an irregularity is detected. And the one more security measure at the network level we can have is demilitarized zone and the data encryption. So demilitarized zone and data encryption are also deployed as security measures in a virtualized and cloud environments. So we discussed the different measures for the security at the compute level. We discussed the different measures for security at the network level. Now let us discuss the security measure at the storage level. So major threats to storage systems in virtualized and cloud environments arise due to the systems through compute due to the compromises at the compute, network, and physical security levels. So major threats to the storage systems in virtualized and cloud environments arise due to the compromises at the compute, network, and the physical security levels. This is because access to the storage system is through compute and network infrastructure. Okay. Therefore, adequate security measures should be in place at the compute and the network levels to ensure storage security. Now, what are the common security mechanisms that we have here are access control methods to regulate which users and processes access the data on the storage system. We can implement zoning and LUN masking on the storage systems, encryption of data at rest on the storage system and the data in transit. Data encryption can also include encrypting backups and storing encryption keys separately from the data. Data shredding that removes the traces of deleted data. These are the security measures at the storage level that we can implement. First one is access control methods to regulate which users and processes can access data on the storage systems. We can also implement LUN masking and zoning. So we can encrypt the data at rest as well as data in transit. So data encryption does not include data only at the local site. It also includes data encrypting of the primary copy along with the encryption of the backup copies and storing the encryption keys separately from the data. Data shredding can also be implemented that removes the traces of the deleted data. Once the data is deleted from the storage system, we need to perform data shredding to ensure that no traces of data are left behind. So apart from these mechanisms, isolation of different types of traffics using virtual SANs further enhances the security of the storage system. We can isolate the different type of traffics using different virtual SAN. In the case of storage utilized by hypervisors, additional security steps are required to protect the storage. Storage for hypervisors using cluster file system supporting multiple virtual machines may require separate LUNs for virtual machine components and the virtual machine data. Right? So these are the different ways in which we can or carry out the different security measures. We can carry out security at the compute level, implement the security at the network level or at the storage level. So in this video session, we discuss the security implementation in fiber channel storage area networks. We discuss the storage implementations in network attached storage. We discuss the authentication and authorization in network attached storage file sharing. We discuss what is Kerberos authentication mechanism or Kerberos authentication protocol. We discussed what is the use and what is the network layer firewalls. We discussed something about the IP-SAN challenge handshake authentication protocol, the steps involved in it in detail. And then we also understood what do you mean by ISNS secure discovery domains. And later we discussed what are the security concerns. So we discussed 4 security concerns for storing data in virtualized and cloud environments, that is multi-tenancy, velocity of attack, information assurance and the data privacy. And then we discussed the security measures at the compute level, the network level and the storage level. With this, let us conclude this session on storage area networks. Thank you.